It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have an enormous episode coming your way. We are gonna talk about the almighty Paramount deal with the UFC, but more importantly, we have an interview with the architect of the UFC antitrust lawsuits, Mr. Rob Maysey, Esquire. John, how the hell are you?
Hanging in there.
Hanging in there. Did you know that if you don't subscribe, you cannot get access to the entire show?
I'm really shocked as the host of the show that I can't get access if I don't subscribe. But that should be a lesson to everybody that even I am withheld the entire show unless I subscribe.
So, you know what? We're going to go ahead and get right down to brass tacks here, because today it was announced that there is an enormous media rights deal with Paramount and the UFC. All their fight content, all the fight nights, the numbered events will be going to the Paramount network for the next 7 years. And the UFC will be paid $1.1 billion a year. Now, they do say estimated value, so I have two questions for you. First, what's your reaction to the news and to the details that have come out? And second, what's your take on, and I'm using my big air quotes, estimated value?
Well, let's start with the estimated value one first, because that'll play into the rest. I guess there's two thoughts. One is, because it's estimated value, is this straight cash they're getting paid, or is there potentially something like the NFL deal where they're getting equity in the UFC, or the UFC is getting, I should say, more likely the reverse. UFC is getting, or TKO is getting equity in Paramount. That's a small possibility, but I think it's much more likely that when they mean estimated, maybe there is some incremental increases based on metrics, or maybe because it's a little more complex than the usual system of multi-year payments. I should note, a lot of people, and I got this wrong myself, is when we were discussing the UFC pay-per-views. In the Disney SEC filing, that they mentioned that the fees were smaller because of poor pay-per-view sales. Paraphrasing, I don't have the exact language right in front of me. But the mistake I made, and I think everybody else made, and that Dan Brown pointed out on Twitter, is that if you look, that is in the revenue section. So the fees they're talking about are the fees that Disney was collecting. And so the UFC's payment is guaranteed every year to go up. There's nothing apparently in the ESPN deal that would limit what they're getting paid from ESPN for those pay-per-views. That's a locked deal. So I imagine this Paramount deal is the same, that every year it'll progress, but possibly there might be some benchmarks they have to hit. So that's why they say estimated. Again, they did note that it's back-ended the money. So my guess right now is that it'll be something like, starting at $700 million, and every year it goes up $100 million, except for the last 2 years, let's say $200 million. So that would average out $1.1 billion, but the last 2 years would be much higher amounts. So that's my guess what we're going to see. But a lot of details still waiting to come out. Now, about my reaction, several. One is, I think, like everybody, pretty surprised that Paramount got this.
If I may, a couple of months ago, we talked about the broadcast deal. And during that, when we were having you spitball who had their fingers in the pie, so to speak, to get this deal, you did mention Paramount in one of our shows. So I just want to put that out there.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, I did think Paramount had a chance because it was something they were interested in, but I thought it'd be a small piece. I did not think they would have the ability to pay this much money, considering some of the trouble they're having. Also, I did not think the UFC would want to go to them because they have a smaller footprint. ESPN is a much better audience that they're targeting with ESPN. So, but hey, we'll take credit for it. Everybody, we got it right. Just like the other people are taking credit, we'll take credit too. But the deal that surprised me, that it got 1.1 billion actually surprised me, because I thought, based on comments made by Shapiro and others during previous interviews, that they were setting the bar lower, that expectations had gone down over time. So this was above and beyond. The top end most people were estimating was 1 billion. So this is above that. So that caught me off guard. The other thing caught me off guard, and this might change based on some stories that just floated as we're recording, that they're getting rid of pay-per-view. Many of the fight night, many of the pay-per-view numbered cards will be on network CBS. And for fans, this is a great deal. What was the most expensive sport to follow, where you had to dish out over $1,000 a year if you legally wanted to watch it, or actually $100 a month on average when you add the subscription to ESPN Plus, is now going to be a fraction of that. So this is great news for the fans, at least on the price part. So that's my initial reaction on all that. But there's, as more details are coming in, as we're learning more about it, we'll probably change our opinions on some things.
I saw you and others bring up on Twitter, and I even mentioned to you in direct messages early this morning when we first found out, that there's a Trump connection, that Trump may have had something to do with this deal. Can you explain why that would be and how plausible that is?
It's interesting because if people are not aware, there was a problem with Trump and Paramount. Paramount, which owns CBS, Paramount was trying to get a merger to go through with Skydance, multi-billion merger. It was kind of necessary for the company in many ways. That was their argument. We have to do this merger to stay relevant. But Trump was upset. The administration was upset with CBS because they accused CBS of being biased against them because they edited. I'll use air quotes on that. They edited the interview, an interview with Kamala Harris. And that they thought that showed that they called that election interference. And everybody thought this was just a ridiculous lawsuit filed by Trump. But lo and behold, CBS settled, which the news agencies were, the news services at CBS were pissed about this because they thought they should fight, stand up. This is like the Insider. You guys got to stand up for your news team. And they did not. And they caved in. So that's the background of the Trump administration. It's no surprise if you're following the news, the Trump administration is using a lot of leverage that the government has to extract compliance from media companies. Now, in the case of CBS and Paramount, in addition to that, the FCC still was blocking this merger. Many of the negotiations took place between Ellison, the head of Paramount, with Trump at the UFC event, and it was supposedly arranged by Dana White. And so that took place. And then there's the additional information that a few days after the merger was approved by the FCC over the protests of members of the FCC, that a few days after it was approved, that Paramount decided not just to buy the fight nights package, but the entire pay-per-view package as well, drastically increasing the value. Now, we got to put on our tinfoil hats a little bit here, but it seems plausible, maybe not the most likely, but a non-zero chance. And people should, hopefully the people that are on Twitter that got upset about that know what a non-zero chance means, that there's a non-zero chance that this is something of a quid pro quo, because the UFC, Dana White and them helped orchestrate the merger with Skydance. And as a payback, possibly for doing that, they paid this large sum of money for the UFC. So I think all that's, is it the most likely explanation? Probably not. Most likely is they wanted to get in business with the UFC for multiple reasons. But it's not completely impossible that that's what happened, considering all the other things that are happening around this administration.
We're going to talk about pay-per-views here for a second, but we are receiving information. There's an interview out there with Dana White saying that the pay-per-view model isn't actually going away. But then we have Mark Shapiro saying that it is going away. So for this question, we'll just operate under the original assumption that pay-per-views will be going away and that this will all be DTC content, direct to consumer. So, but there's pay-per-view bonuses for fighters where they get points, as Tom Aspinall noted to Ariel Helwani. But then you have Nikisa Badarian of Most Valuable Promotions tweeting that, and I quote, "This is great for fighter pay if fighter managers do their job right." How do you think this really impacts the fighters?
Well, I mean, it honestly doesn't impact the fighters much at all because the fighters have no leverage. We had previous incidences. We have previous cases of the UFC revealing that they have a new deal, that they're making a ton more money. And, the UFC did not increase pay because they got that ESPN deal. I think there's a possibility that some fighters' wage level does go up to keep them happy. But I don't think the wage share is going to go up at all. I don't think the basic starting pay, which did not increase after Endeavor was bought, or WME at the time bought it from Zuffa, the 10-10 starting pay stayed the same. It remained the same when they signed that big ESPN deal. And I've got a feeling it probably will remain the same in place, the same fight of the night bonuses, all that stuff will stay the same with this new deal. What's going to change, though, is some fighters are going to have to negotiate flat deals because they had back-end pay-per-view points, but pay-per-view sales have been down. Most fighters aren't making much on that. But I don't think that changes much either because the UFC has a structured system. They have a tiered system, and I think that it's going to be more structured than it has in the past. There will be less exceptions. In the past, they have the S tier, a select few stars that have these kind of unique deals. I think everybody's now going to be much more along their tiered system and remain in that. And there's little leverage fighters will have. The pay will be, do we want this guy? How motivated are we to get this guy to show up and fight? How much more are we willing to entice him to make sure he shows up and doesn't hold out? That's the only leverage fighters have. But even that has its limits because we saw John Jones held up for years for his Deontay Wilder money. He never got the Deontay Wilder money. We saw Francis Ngannou have negotiation problems with the UFC. They let him go. We saw, Nate Diaz the same. They let him go. We saw Conor McGregor have problems with the UFC. They let him hold out. They sat him on the shelf for a long time. So the UFC doesn't budge. And so for the fighters, I think it's basically there's going to be little change. It'll be more of the same.
With the news of this deal and UFC leaving ESPN, where does that leave PFL?
Well, PFL's got to be super happy because this is what they wanted. We've talked about this several times, that PFL's whole business model, business plan seems to be that we are going to offer an alternative to the UFC, the Pepsi to their Coca-Cola. We are going to go to the places that were unable to sign the UFC when they get their next rights deal because it was too much for them. And then we will offer a cheaper alternative, but it'll be much, much higher than what we're paying now. So for PFL, I think they've got to be very happy because this is what this is why they brought that new executive in. This is exactly what they wanted to happen. I'm not sure they're going to get the massive deal they're hoping for, but everything's lined up perfectly for them to make the deal they were hoping for. ESPN lost the UFC. ESPN might have an interest in keeping some MMA content. PFL has been on ESPN. This is the time to say, hey, we are going to give you a larger TV deal so you can go out and get better fighters and retain some of that audience that we're losing from the UFC leaving. But I do not know how realistic it is to retain that audience when there's there's very little crossover with the promotions. The top draws, top biggest name fighters are all locked up under the UFC. So you're going to have that problem. But this is what they're hoping for. And their hope is that ESPN commits for which to them is a very sizable amount of money. But I am not sure they'll do that. I think it's just as possible, too, because this rights deal, you notice, did not mention Dana White's Contender Series. I think it's very possible that Contender Series is a separate brand. It's not part of the UFC technically. I mean, it's part of the same TKO company, but they don't package with the UFC. And I think it's very possible that Dana White Contenders we get an announcement that they've got a new deal for that, and maybe ESPN retains that part of it and doubles the amount of Contender Series. But if that doesn't happen, PFL, this is their big moment. Let's see if their business plan works and they're able to get the big TV deal they were hoping for.
Final question before we get ready for Rob Maysey is, I want you to rate the winners and losers in this deal. Well,
the winners are obvious. The winners is the UFC. they're the big winner. They're getting a tremendous amount of money thrown at them, above and beyond the average annual valuation of the previous deal. They're getting $600 million extra. Let's go with Goldman Sachs said that the 15% would go to cost, which is the fighters. That means $510 million in additional, net income that goes straight to EBITDA, then goes straight to profit. So they are sitting very pretty. So they're the big winner. Next after them, I'd say the fans, if this pay-per-view thing holds up, if they didn't misspeak, if the pay-per-views are truly dead, then this is an incredible cost savings for fans. Even if they start increasing the price of the subscription service, which I expect them to do, they could increase it, double it, and it still would be savings for fans, especially if they put many of the events on CBS. So those are the two biggest winners. The loser, as is common, is the fighters. They get nothing out of this deal. I mean, I'm sure some of them are sending their, congratulations to the UFC, but you are not going to get anything out of this. And I think potentially a loser on this from the deal point, and it's, maybe it'll end up being successful, is Paramount. Paramount there's no way they're going to make their money back from this. But their hope is, I think it's a loss leader. Maybe that pans out. I kind of question the possibility of that working out. But again, there's also the possibility that maybe the deal's so pricey is because they had to use that to entice Donald Trump to let the merger go through, in which case maybe it is a winner for him. And then neutral, I guess, wait and see is PFL, because, if the ESPN deal opens up for them now and they get a big deal, they're a winner. But if the ESPN then gets the contenders and has no interest in them, then they could end up being a big loser as well.
All right. So that's going to wrap up our little mini portion of what we know right now about the Paramount UFC media rights deal. Stick around. We will be right back with Rob Maysey. All right, kids, we are back. And as promised, we have the one, the only Rob Maysey. He is the architect of the UFC antitrust lawsuit, the original and the Johnson case. He is also out there with the MMA-FA, which he started. He founded that, the MMA Fighters Association. He's got a litany of accolades and titles and everything else. And I'm going to turn it over to John Nash, and he is going to tell you all the rest of the cool stuff that Rob Maysey has done.
Well, we're happy to have Rob on here with us. And I'll give you a quick rundown, because if you ever listen to Rob talk, it'll take forever to go through the rundown of his career. But we're going to go really quickly. Here's some of the high points why he's on this show is he is an attorney, that he is the person that started the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association, one of the first attempts to organize fighters. He is the person, along with Carlos Newton, that crafted the concept of the antitrust case that was filed against the UFC back in December 16, 2014, Lee v. Johnson. He's one of the attorneys that has worked on that case all the way until its settlement. He's also part of the team that has filed the other lawsuits against the UFC, namely Johnson v. Zuffa, Serkinov v. Zuffa, and Davis v. Zuffa. So he's part of all that. And additionally, he was spearheaded in partnership with Mark Wayne Mullen, an attempt to expand the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act to cover mixed martial arts and other combat sports. Got introduced into Congress. It was in committee where it didn't go any further than that, which I'm sure we're going to talk about soon. And so he has a stake in knowledge in all the major happenings of the UFC and mixed martial arts right now, including this, the Muhammad Ali bill, antitrust cases, and fighter organizing and fighter pay. So I thought with what's going on with recent news, I thought it'd be good to have Rob on to give his opinion. So Rob, welcome to Hey Not the Face for your second appearance.
Hey, thank you for having me on, and thanks for the very kind introduction.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's about as kind as I can do, but we have to let people, I'm sure most people that listen to this, I'm sure all of our listeners are aware of who you are. So I'm sure it's redundant to most of them, but just in case some of them that were not aware, I thought it'd be good to give you a little synopsis of his career. But to get started here, Rob, the first question I want to ask you is, what's your immediate reaction to this new broadcast deal that was announced today with Paramount and the UFC?
But my immediate reaction was, what happens to the fighters that have a pay-per-view bonus built into their promotional agreements? Because it seems to me, if they're doing away with pay-per-views, a material portion of the consideration that those fighters were offered in their contracts has been taken away. And the analogy I give is, if I went to you, John, and I said, hey, John, lay the bricks for the street in our neighborhood, and when you're finished, I'll give you this house. And you do 2/3 of it, and before you finish, I sell the house. What is the consideration I'm now offering you?
No. Well, now, are you suggesting that people that have this question should maybe contact you?
I would, if I was listening to this show, and in particular, there are a handful of fighters in the UFC that have the ability to enter into marquee fights outside of the UFC, or to at least create a bidding scenario where they can probably up their pay in the UFC. But to do that, you have to be willing to lodge a challenge. And it seems to me, if a material portion of your contract has now been taken away, you have a valid claim that you probably should explore.
So what you're saying is that there's actually, I was going to joke that, will this deal spur fighters to finally do something about getting a bigger share of the pie, which is the joke, because the fighters never do. But in this case, there are actually fighters that have their contracts are being changed on them that might have leverage, if they're willing to use it, to actually get a bigger share of the pie.
Just one fighter in particular that, jumps off the screen to me, it was just obvious, is John Jones. I mean, he's got a probably $100 million fight waiting in Francis Ngannou, but to get that, he's got to get out of the UFC. Now, if they change the terms of his contract unilaterally, which it sounds like they did, that could be grounds to get out of your contract, or at least negotiate another one.
Yeah. So this is actually, if fighters are willing to use it, a great opportunity for them.
It could be
willing to use it. Yeah.
Yes, it could be, if they're willing to use it. Now, I'm sure the UFC will say no fighter is guaranteed pay-per-view splits, and it's entirely up to their discretion as to who is in their pay-per-view bout or not. But at some point, that argument carries too much water if the UFC basically says it's within their complete discretion all the time. Well, that would mean it's essentially illusory if they could just yank it away. Okay.
Now, this deal that just got announced that the UFC, we talked about it before you came on the show, is that, based on the annual average valuation, it's going to add like $500-600 million to the UFC's coffers. So there is 800-pound gorilla is now a 1,600-pound gorilla, just a massive force in the sport. But do you think this deal make all your efforts harder in some way? Because you've been arguing for a fighters association, you've been arguing for ways to create more competition, but doesn't this amount of money entrench the UFC's monopoly more? And also, if you talk about your antitrust cases, does it make it harder to create the economic models you need to make for that antitrust case, because you no longer have like pay-per-view sales you can link to individual fighters?
Yeah. I am in particular curious to see how they're going to allocate those annual revenues per show, because it sounds like what they're attempting to do is just to smooth the revenue over 43 events to where they're all essentially the same, with the exception of maybe 4 shows that cross over to CBS. Now, if that's the case, it's going to be more difficult for an economist to model which fighter is driving what revenue, because the revenue sounds like it's going to be close to the same for all the shows. That will be a new wrinkle for this case, if that is what is occurring. I don't know that for a fact yet, because obviously we haven't seen their financials and this deal just happened. Now, in terms of whether this has increased their monopoly status, I think undoubtedly. I mean, their rights fees essentially doubled, which is what they said they were setting out to do. It sounds like they did accomplish that. not only did they accomplish that, they tied up a whole lot of other sort of outlets that were in the mix to bid on martial arts. So it's going to be very difficult for another promotion that, doesn't have Fight Pass. It doesn't have all of the, entrenched library. It doesn't have all of the built-in outlets that the UFC now has for whatever they do. It's a tremendous moat that they have established.
And on top of that, too, is like they have this excess money now that they have, that even if someone could come in and potentially bid for a fighter, it's like, well, the UFC could pick and choose when they want to go above and beyond and barely dip into this additional revenue they got coming in. Because I think the PFL in a presentation they have, or for the size of the MMA market, they estimate the MMA market at 1.75 billion last year, which UFC had 80% of it worldwide. Now with this new deal, they basically have 90% plus worldwide again. So
sort of we talk about this a lot in our group with fighters, and Carlos brings this up a lot in his interviews, and it's the notion that monopolies tend to be cancerous, meaning they're not content with just one monopoly. They start to spread into other industries. And we're seeing exactly that. The UFC, because they have monopoly rents in MMA, can now use those profits in ways boxing promoters cannot to attempt to monopolize boxing. That's exactly what we're starting to see happen now.
Well, good point. Now, going back really quick to that contract, that argument that they could challenge the contracts. How would the arbitration agreement written in that contract impact that?
If the fighter had an arbitration clause, two things are happening. So with the Misha Cirkunov case, we're challenging the validity of that arbitration provision and class action waiver. And the grounds of challenging that are they inserted that clause during a time when the judge had already made a finding that they're acting as a monopsony. And already made a finding that they have market power. That's a little unusual, a unique set of facts that I don't believe any case is addressed head on. Now there are other cases where the courts have essentially allowed these sort of provisions to be inserted despite the unfairness, but this one is new in that we already had an action pending based upon coercion and market power. And the judge had already in the hearings said, I find that you are acting with market power. So that's a little unique. That case is basically in its infancy. So we don't have a decision in that case yet. While that arbitration clause is pending and there's no ruling on that case, it is likely if we filed a complaint, they would file a motion to compel arbitration. We'd end up in arbitration pending the result of the Cirkunov case.
Oh, okay. So if the fighters listened to you and said, hey, I'm going to challenge UFC to improve my situation because this is a material change in my contract because you got rid of pay-per-views, they would most likely have to go to arbitration to get that settled. That contract.
I believe anyone who signed a promotional agreement September 28th, 2020 or after is going to have a class action waiver and individual arbitration clause. So until those clauses, until a ruling is entered on our challenge to those clauses, it is likely those will end up in arbitration.
Okay, but you still think it'd be worthwhile if you had one of them potentially to renegotiate your contract this way?
For at least a few who have options for big money fights, yes.
Okay. The handful of the big one, the guys that could obviously get some sort of that have a drawing power on their own without the rest of the MMA industry behind them. So okay, so a handful, top 5 or 6 guys probably. Okay.
Yeah, it'll be the fighters that have big money fights available, and there aren't a whole lot of those, but in particular, John Jones has got an enormous fight waiting for him.
Yeah. And then we could say Conor McGregor, but we all know he ain't fighting again. the way he looks. Okay, now let's get the reason we brought you on originally was because there's been a bill introduced, the new Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. So first, what are your thoughts of this new bill that's been introduced? What was your thoughts when you saw this?
I was not surprised at all that they were introducing their own amendment. I was quite surprised at how gross their amendment is. It is essentially written for only one company, TKO, and there's a number of reasons I think that is the case. And they're sort of public push to fool the commissions, to fool the public and to fool Congress. Is we're not touching a word of the Ali Act. All of our changes are to the prior act to give fighters more choice. That is just nonsense. Their amendment essentially strikes out page after page after page of all of the protections that were inserted by the Ali Act and provides an exemption really just to them. And the reason I say it only applies to them, even though it's written generically, is they are likely going to be the only promoter that can efficiently and economically comply with the requirements to become a UBO. It'll be too expensive for other promotions to set up a UBO on a level sufficient to actually compete with them.
No, yeah. I mean, I think listeners of the show are aware that we've said the exact same thing. I mean, you look at the provisions in the act where it includes to be a UBO, you have to cover injury insurance outside of the fight during training. That's something the UFC offers. That's going to cost a large body of fighters. If you have several hundred, it's going to cost $5 to $10 million probably to do that. For the UFC, the TKO, they already have the UFC, so they already have a policy in place. It's probably less expensive for them to add additional fighters to it, boxers. You also have to have a training facility that can serve as a rehab facility. They have the PI Institute. Everybody else has to rebuild it. So, it seems obvious to us, and we've noted it, that this was built specifically to make it very hard for anybody else to do what TKO wants to do, which is be a UBO, because other promotions' profits would be eaten up just by those additional costs in boxing. So,
the other two, you sort of touched on them. The mandatory drug testing is going to be very expensive for another promoter to replicate, and because they don't have the UFC scale, they're going to be paying more on a per fighter basis than the UFC does. And then the training facility, I joke, and I'm not joking. Could I throw up a heavy bag in my garage and call that a PI? Because what I suspect they're going to do is, when regulations come out around this bill that they're trying to get passed, they're going to say something like, it has to be no less than 80,000 square feet. Well, again, who is doing that, and who already has 4 around the world?
Yeah. So when you read that bill, do you have any doubts that TKO is looking to monopolize boxing when you read that bill?
I have no doubt whatsoever. In fact, I just saw an article today where Don King sent a cease and desist to TKO for signing a boxer. Their public story is we're starting at the grassroots level, and we're going to be building our own stars. Well, this cease and desist was involving a fighter that's up for a title already. That is their intent. They are going to pay more initially to get star fighters to where it doesn't matter which side of the bout wins. They are going to attempt to control the best boxers in each weight division to where the next challengers for them to be, draws to the public are going to have to challenge those TKO fighters. That contract's going to be slightly worse. The next round of challengers is going to be slightly worse.
Now, I mean, and this goes hand in hand also with your efforts. There's a reason why you wanted to expand the Ali Act. There's a reason the Phil Davis case cites the Ali Act again and again. But it's amazing to me how many people miss the idea that owning the title, a promoter controlling the title, has been looked on for long in the history of boxing as a way to monopolize the sport.
So we just gave a presentation.
I was going to ask you about that. Ask you in a little bit, but might as well ask you now. You guys gave a presentation at the ABC a convention about the. My understanding is you guys gave a presentation about why they should not pass this bill, how important the Ali Act is for fighters. I understand Pat English was there and spoke after you guys, was wearing a John McCain hat or a USS McCain hat. What was the reaction to that presentation you guys gave?
So that presentation, we focused intentionally on the legislative history behind the Ali Act because there's a whitewashing, I would say, going on as to the purpose of the act and whether it works or not. Well, there's no monopoly in boxing, so I would say it's been very successful. So successful that TKO now feels the need to change it. In our presentation, we paragraph after paragraph laid out, here is the legislative history saying the act is designed to prevent monopoly. If you allow a promoter to control rank and title, it is only a matter of time until, through sheer network effects, they cobble together most of 1 through 10 and all of the champions, and they become a monopoly. That is the UFC. That is what they did. That is what they want to do in boxing. And in order to do it in boxing, they have to change the act. Now, what was the response to our presentation? I was very pleasantly pleased with Pat English. Pat English, during the Q&A session, we quoted him. It was, I believe, the second to the last slide. We quoted his letter that he sent out the Friday before, basically saying this act should not apply. While the Ali Act is not perfect, this amendment will do far more harm than good. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. We quote him. Pat English makes a comment during the Q&A session about his hat. Carla Duran asked him, "Hey, what is that hat you're wearing?" And he explains that it's the USS John McCain hat, and how McCain was instrumental in the passage of the initial Ali Act. And this came right after KJ Johnson, during our presentation, said Ali would be rolling over in his grave at what they are attempting to do. Pat English said the same thing. Ali would indeed be rolling over in his grave with this proposed amendment. He thought it was gross as well. Now, the commissions, we were the board of the ABC, I believe, has 10 members. It is not clear to us that more than 4 members actually saw this draft ahead of time. We're sure 4 had it. We're not sure about the other 10. And then outside of those 10, the other 60, 70 commission members that were in attendance, virtually none of them were ever provided a draft of this bill ahead of time. Most didn't even know this amendment existed until that conference, which is kind of telling. This isn't some unanimous effort on behalf of the states. This seems to be an arranged ram job through California, Florida, Utah, and I'm drawing a blank on the last one.
No, well, you know what? I'm going to come back to this. I want to talk more about the ABC, but I just want to.
Mohegan. I'm sorry.
Mohegan. Yeah, with Mazzulli, obviously. Who hasn't, I invited him on the show. I'm still hoping to get Mike Mazzulli. I'm hoping to get any of them to come on the show. But continue on the what Pat English said. It's interesting too, is that all these people through the support behind this bill, which doesn't address the problems people say that boxing has usually, but none of them supported the John McCain bill that he introduced year after year that was to address the problems everybody knew that the Ali Act had, which is the Professional Boxing Amendment Act. And it's interesting to me that they're going to draft this new bill when there was already a bill that's been drafted that preserves the protections of the Ali Act, but also fixes what people thought were the problems with it. And yet no one wants to throw their support behind it. In fact, Zuffa lobbied for years against that bill.
Yeah, so. No, their intent in attempting to pass this amendment to us is obvious, that they want an exemption to legitimize their reality show model in an actual sport, which allows them to obtain a monopoly. That is what they are trying to do. That is why they.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!